The 1950s and 60s were littered with discrimination and segregation, but after the Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education, desegregation was put underway. Despite the court ruling of desegregation in educational facilities, traditional attitudes and resistance hindered desegregation, though the ruling would prevail and progress for African American people would be made. The basis of the Brown v. Board of Education case began in the late 1800s with a different court case. Plessy v. Ferguson was a highly influential case that took place in 1896. Homer Plessy was mixed race but classified as African American and thus forced to comply with segregation laws. In the case Homer Adolph Plessy v. the State of Louisiana, Plessy's lawyers argued against segregated train cars, saying that it denied Plessy his rights under the 13th and 14th Amendments. The judge in this case was John Howard Ferguson, and he ruled that Louisiana had the right to regulate railroad companies which operated within state boundaries, requiring all people to be separate but equal. The 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868. It granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including people recently freed from slavery. Also, it kept states from denying anyone life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The 14th Amendment was able to increase civil rights protection to all Americans regardless of skin color or socioeconomic standings. These two major events in American history would come to be the base evidence of many cases during the civil rights movement in the 1950s. In 1934, the NAACP hired Thurgood Marshall as a part of their legal defense team. Between 1936 and 1950, there were four major cases that came before Brown v. Board of Education. There was the case of Murray v. Maryland in 1936. This case was where the University of Maryland was rejecting black applicants purely because of race. Thurgood Marshall tackled this injustice by arguing that the rejected student in question, Donald Gaines Murray, was just as qualified to attend as any of the white applicants. Murray was admitted by court ruling. The second court case was Missouri ex rel. Gaines v. Canada in 1938. Lloyd Gaines applied to the University of Missouri Law School but was denied because of his race. Marshall won the case and Gaines was admitted to the University of Missouri. The third case was Sweat v. Painter in 1950. It was the rejection of Herman Sweat from the University of Texas white law school. The NAACP tackled this case because they were encouraged from their win in Gaines's case. The NAACP continued to attack racial discrimination in higher education with the McLaurin v. Oklahoma Board of Regents of Higher Education in 1950, which was a continuation of the NAACP protecting unfairly rejected African American students because of their race. All four of these cases were argued on the basis that the students were being denied their basic rights as stated by the 14th Amendment and an education that was separate but equal as stated by Plessy v. Ferguson, because the educations they had been offered would have been subpar compared to the main universities. Thus, the separate but equal doctrine perpetuated inferior services, treatment, and accommodations for African Americans as segregation dominated the 60 years prior to the U.S. Supreme Court's landmark case, Brown v. Board of Education. By 1900, segregated societies that confined colored Americans to second-class citizenship had been created in both the North and the South. Jim Crow laws designed to restrict social contact between whites and people of color segregated housing, jobs, public spaces, and school, thus limiting the freedom and opportunity of colored Americans. Segregated education in particular confined colored children to a subservient societal role. Separate schools were established for African Americans and children of other ethnicities. These separate schools would often have outdated textbooks handed down from white schools. Specifically in the South, fewer African American children were enrolled in school, and many left school after 4th grade. More public funding went to white schools, and many towns in the rural South only constructed a school for whites due to the lack of resources to build two separate schools. African American school buildings tended to be run down, overcrowded, and short of teachers and supplies. In the face of these problems, African American parents and teachers established an educational self-help tradition. African American communities, despite being poor, would use their own resources and support from white charities to build and maintain schools. Some high schools and colleges for African Americans even provided educational opportunities that rivaled those provided to whites. However, the general conditions of education were obviously unequal and unsatisfactory. All across the country, African Americans fought against school segregation with little money or public support. Legal cases were filed and argued before unsympathetic white judges and school boards. Nonetheless, the legal battle against segregation continued. In 1950 and 1951, African American parents and children alike filed 5 cases with the help of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. The plaintiffs filed the cases on the grounds of unequal segregated schools, harmful psychological effects generated by segregated schools, overcrowded and underfunded schools, and schools too far from the homes of African American children. The 5 cases, Briggs v. Elliott, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Davis v. School Board of Prince Edward County, Belton v. Gebhardt, and Bowling v. Sharp, were consolidated into Brown v. Board of Education when they all came before the Supreme Court in 1952. The case was at first argued before the Vinson Court, headed by Chief Justice Fred M. Vinson. Vinson did not support the plaintiff's stance for desegregation and remained a stumbling block for the case until his death in September of 1953. Upon Vinson's death, President Eisenhower appointed Earl Warren as Chief Justice. To stall for time, Associate Justice Felix Frankfurter convinced the court to re-argue the case so that all the justices could be convinced to make a unanimous decision. Although a majority of the justices already supported desegregation, it was felt that a unanimous ruling would take away a possible counter-argument that a divided decision would create for the segregation supporters. Chief Justice Warren argued that Plessy v. Ferguson had to be overturned if the court were to maintain its authority as foundation of liberty. During a 1954 speech to American Bar Association, Warren stated, "Our American system, like all others, is on trial both at home and abroad. The way it works, the manner in which it solves the problems of our day, the extent to which we maintain the spirit of our Constitution with its Bill of Rights, will in the long run do more to make it both secure and the object of adulation than the number of hydrogen bombs we stockpile." Major Supreme Courts like Brown informed other nations about the true workings of American democracy. Segregation and racial violence put a hole in the identity of democracy, which was at the time emphasized by the Cold War. Indeed, for years, the international press had focused on and attacked racial segregation and civil rights failings in America. The Soviet Union took advantage of racial injustices by making American racism a principal propaganda theme by the late 1940s. The propaganda had an impact as other nations focused their attention on American injustices. With the balance of power turning on the faith other nations had in democracy, with the U.S. hoping to use that faith to make allies with newly independent nations, Brown became an important case for the U.S. foreign relations. The justices were all aware of the Cold War perceptions of the U.S. in relation to segregation. In an amicus curiae brief, the Justice Department argued that segregation had a negative effect on foreign relations, even among friendly nations. In the end, Warren obtained a unanimous ruling that overturned Plessy v. Ferguson and the separate but equal doctrine. Taking away the legal groundwork for segregation was one thing, but implementing and enforcing the ruling was another. In 1955, the ruling in Brown stated that desegregation should occur with all deliberate speed. The ambiguous wording of the decision led many Southern states to resist, delay, and avoid significant integration for years by closing down school systems, financing segregated private schools, and using token integration in which only a few carefully chosen African American students would be allowed into white schools, thus leaving the majority of African American schools unequal. Southern resistance to the ruling also came in the form of legal obstacles that prevented desegregation and physical resistance. Overall, resistance to the ruling varied. In 1957, the governor of Arkansas, Orville Forbes, called out the National Guard to block the entry of African American students to Central High School in Little Rock. President Eisenhower eventually federalized Arkansas National Guard and sent in federal troops to force integration. In 1963, the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, blocked the door to an auditorium at the University of Alabama in order to prevent the enrollment of 2 African Americans. While blocking the entrance, Wallace affirmed his policy of segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Wallace only moved when he was confronted by General Henry Graham of the National Guard, whom Kennedy had ordered to intervene. The incident became known as the Stand in the Schoolhouse Door. Greensboro, North Carolina was the first city in the South to publicly abide by the decision, beginning with an announcement of compliance on May 18, 1954. However, in reality, the city set up legal obstacles that stalled the transition to a fully integrated school system, which did not begin until 1971. All the resistance, however, did not go unanswered. On the contrary, the legal and social obstacles that were created served as catalysts for the student protests that kicked off the civil rights movement. With the legal grounds for second-class citizenship permanently discredited, activists were able to pursue advances in civil rights and advances in the desegregation of housing, public accommodations, and higher education institutions. In the North, Brown stimulated activism among African American parents, leading to the creation of some of the first freedom schools during a 1959 boycott of schools in New York, which was started to put pressure on a lawsuit that was founded on the Brown ruling. Although the Brown decision was a milestone for civil rights, its implementation was hindered due to the resistance and entrenched social attitudes. Despite this, progress was made in desegregation as civil rights activists were inspired to further pursue equal rights.